The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Millhaven, a quaint town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. Kalen Thorne had always found solace in the rhythmic sounds of his bakery coming to life before dawn, the gentle hum of ovens warming, the soft thud of dough being kneaded, the whispered conversations of early customers seeking their daily bread. Today, however, an unsettling silence hung in the air like morning fog that refused to lift. From behind the flour-dusted counter, Kalen noticed that Mrs. Pemberton hadn't arrived for her usual 7 o'clock croissant, nor had young Timothy Fletcher burst through the doors demanding his mother's weekly order of dinner rolls. The absence of familiar faces created an inexplicable knot in his stomach, though he couldn't quite articulate why. He wiped his hands on his apron and stepped outside, the brass bell above the door chiming its lonely song into the empty street. Across the square, Zephyra Castellane was experiencing her own sense of unease. As the town's veterinarian, she was accustomed to early morning emergencies, but today her phone had remained eerily silent. No frantic calls about injured livestock, no worried pet owners seeking advice about their beloved companions. She stood at her clinic window, watching the deserted streets with growing concern. Even the stray cats that usually prowled the alleyways seemed to have vanished overnight. The first sign that something was catastrophically wrong came at exactly 8:15, when a blood-curdling scream echoed from the residential district near Elm Street. Both Kalen and Zephyra turned toward the sound, their hearts racing as the scream was joined by another, then another, until a chorus of terror filled the morning air. Without thinking, Kalen abandoned his bakery and ran toward the commotion, his baker's instincts replaced by something more primal, the need to help his neighbors. Zephyra grabbed her medical bag and followed, her veterinary training having taught her that in crisis situations, every second counted. As they converged on Elm Street, they were joined by others emerging from their hiding places: Thaddeus Grimwald, the elderly librarian whose weathered hands shook as he clutched a walking stick; Isadora Blackthorne, barely 17 but with eyes that held a fierce determination; and Maxim Volkov, the town's blacksmith whose massive frame and calloused hands spoke of years spent shaping metal and fire. What they discovered on Elm Street defied every rational explanation their minds could construct. Mrs. Pemberton, or what had once been Mrs. Pemberton, was crouched over the motionless form of the mailman, her teeth buried deep in his throat. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. When she looked up at the approaching group, her eyes had lost all trace of humanity. They were milky white and vacant, yet somehow filled with an insatiable hunger. Thaddeus was the first to break the stunned silence. "Sweet merciful God," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing sounds of chaos erupting throughout the town. "It's just like those old stories my grandmother used to tell, the dead walking among the living." Maxim stepped forward, his blacksmith's hammer appearing in his massive hands as if by magic. "Stories or not, that thing killed Henderson," he growled, referring to the mailman whose uniform was now soaked crimson. "And if there's one, there's likely to be more." As if summoned by his words, more figures began stumbling out of houses and around corners, neighbors they had known for years, now transformed into something nightmarish. Old Mr. Chin from the hardware store dragged one leg behind him, a massive bite mark visible on his shoulder. Sarah Williams, who had just celebrated her 25th birthday last week, moved with the same unnatural gait, her party dress torn and stained with blood that wasn't her own. Isadora grabbed Zephyra's arm, her young voice steady despite the terror surrounding them. "We need to get somewhere safe," she said, her words cutting through the group's shock. "Now." Kalen found himself taking charge, his mind racing to process this impossible situation. "The community center," he said decisively. "It's built like a fortress, stone walls and limited entrances. If we can get there, we can figure out what's happening and how to survive it." As the group began to move, staying close together while navigating around the growing number of infected townsfolk, none of them could have imagined that this was only the beginning. The peaceful town of Millhaven was becoming ground zero for humanity's greatest challenge, and their survival would depend not just on their ability to fight the undead, but on their capacity to remain human in the face of unimaginable horror. The journey to the community center proved more treacherous than Kalen had anticipated. What should have been a simple 3-block walk through familiar streets had become a deadly obstacle course. The group moved in single file, with Maxim leading the way, his hammer ready to strike, while Thaddeus brought up the rear despite his age, his walking stick transformed into an improvised weapon. Zephyra found herself constantly checking over her shoulder, her veterinary knowledge providing disturbing insights into what they were witnessing. The bite patterns, she whispered to Kaylin as they crept past an overturned delivery truck. They're not random. These things are targeting the neck and major arteries, almost like they instinctively know where to inflict maximum damage. The community center loomed ahead, its solid stone construction a beacon of hope in the chaos. But as they approached, it became clear they weren't the only ones seeking refuge. Cordelia Ashworth, the town's emergency coordinator, was already barricading the main entrance with the help of Lysander Quinn, a research scientist who had moved to Millhaven 6 months ago to study local wildlife migration patterns. Thank God, Cordelia breathed as she spotted their approach. Her usually pristine appearance was disheveled, her emergency coordinator badge hanging askew from a torn blazer. I've been trying to reach anyone on the radio, but there's nothing, just static and screams. Lysander looked up from where he was dragging furniture against the doors, his analytical mind clearly struggling to process the unfolding nightmare. I've documented 17 separate incidents of aggressive behavior in the past 2 hours, he reported, his voice maintaining a clinical detachment even as his hands shook. The victims all display similar symptoms: loss of cognitive function, enhanced physical aggression, and what appears to be in complete absence of pain response. Isadora helped push a heavy desk against the entrance while scanning the windows for potential weak points. Despite her youth, she was proving to be remarkably level-headed under pressure. Whatever's causing this, it's spreading fast, she observed. I saw 3 people get attacked on my way here, and each one was back on their feet within minutes, attacking others. Inside the community center, the group established a temporary command post in the main meeting room. Maps of the town were spread across tables while Cordelia attempted to contact outside authorities using the center's emergency radio equipment. The responses were fragmented and terrifying: reports of similar outbreaks in neighboring towns, emergency services overwhelmed, and government officials recommending citizens shelter in place until further notice. Thaddeus settled into a chair near the window, his elderly frame betraying the exhaustion of their escape. I've lived in this town for 73 years, he said quietly, watching through the glass as familiar faces stumbled past with inhuman gaits. Survived the Great Flood of '82, the tornado outbreak of '95, even that horrible winter when the power was out for 3 weeks. But this... He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Maxim was conducting a methodical inventory of potential weapons, his blacksmith's eye assessing everything from letter openers to fire extinguishers. We can't stay here forever, he announced grimly. These walls are strong, but they won't hold if those things figure out how to break windows or if they come in numbers. Zephyra was examining their limited medical supplies when a new sound reached their ears, not the random groans and shuffling they had grown accustomed to, but something far more chilling. It was the sound of many feet moving in unison, accompanied by a low, rhythmic moaning that seemed to pulse with collective purpose. Lysander pressed his face to the window, his scientific curiosity overcoming his fear. Fascinating, he murmured, though his voice carried an edge of horror. They're not moving randomly anymore. Look, they're forming groups, almost like they're coordinating. Outside, dozens of infected townspeople were indeed gathering in the square, their movements showing an alarming degree of organization. They weren't the shambling, mindless creatures from horror movies, but something far more terrifying, a collective intelligence that seemed to be learning and adapting. Kaylin felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders as the group looked to him for direction. The baker who had been worried about missing customers that morning now found himself responsible for the lives of 7 other human beings in a world that no longer made sense. We need a plan, he said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. Food, water, weapons, and a way out of here when the time comes. But most importantly, we need to stay human. Whatever's happening out there, we can't let it change who we are. As if in response to his words, the infected crowd outside began moving toward the community center with purposeful intent, their collective moaning growing louder. The ultimate survival challenge was about to begin in earnest. The first assault on the community center came at twilight, when shadows blended the living and the dead into an indistinguishable mass of movement. The infected had been gathering throughout the day, their numbers swelling from dozens to what appeared to be hundreds. Kaelin watched from the second-floor window as they pressed against the building's exterior, their pale hands leaving bloody smears on the stone walls. "They're testing for weaknesses," Lysander observed, his scientific mind still functioning despite the horror unfolding below. "See how they're probing different sections? This isn't random behavior, they're learning the building's structure." Cordelia had managed to establish brief contact with emergency services in the neighboring county, but the news was devastating. "The outbreak isn't contained to Millhaven," she reported, her voice hollow with shock. "It's spreading across the entire region. The National Guard is mobilizing, but they're calling it a Level 5 containment breach." Maxim had transformed the community center's workshop into an impromptu armory, fashioning weapons from anything available. Garden tools became spears, chair legs became clubs, and his blacksmith's knowledge allowed him to create surprisingly effective implements of defense. "If we're going to fight, we need to understand our enemy," he said, hefting a makeshift mace. "How do we stop something that doesn't feel pain?" The answer came sooner than anyone wanted. As darkness fell completely, one of the infected, a man Thaddeus recognized as his former chess partner, Walter Hensley, managed to break through a basement window. The sound of shattering glass sent the group into immediate action, but nothing could have prepared them for their first close encounter with the transformed. Walter moved with unnatural speed, his chess-playing hands now ending in claw-like nails that had somehow grown several inches longer. His eyes held no recognition of his old friend Thaddeus, only an insatiable hunger that seemed to burn from within. When Maxim's hammer connected with Walter's shoulder, the impact should have been crippling, but the infected man barely staggered. "The head!" Zephyra shouted, her veterinary training kicking in. "Like rabies, the brain is where the infection must be controlling them." Isadora moved with surprising agility, using a fire poker to strike Walter across the temple. The impact sent him crashing into a wall, where he remained motionless for several heart-stopping seconds before finally going still. The first victory felt hollow, knowing they had just killed someone they had once considered a neighbor and friend. The breach in the basement led to a terrifying realization: the infected outside had gone silent. The constant moaning and scratching had stopped, replaced by an ominous quiet that was somehow more frightening than the noise had been. They were planning something. Thaddeus stood over Walter's body, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "He taught my grandson how to play chess last summer," he whispered. "Such a patient man, such a gentle soul. What kind of world turns kindness into this?" Lysander was examining Walter's transformation with clinical detachment, though his hands trembled as he took notes. "The physical changes are remarkable," he said quietly. "Enhanced muscle density, elongated nails, enlarged canine teeth. It's as if the human body is being optimized for predation." Their discussion was interrupted by a new sound, not from outside, but from the building's ventilation system. Something was moving through the air ducts, and it was moving with purpose. Kaelin motioned for silence as they listened to the scratching sounds traveling overhead, tracking the movement from room to room. "They've found another way in," Cordelia whispered, her emergency coordinator training warring with her basic human terror. "We need to evacuate the building." But as they gathered their supplies and prepared to leave, the sounds in the vents multiplied. Whatever was up there, it wasn't alone. The infected had somehow learned to use the building's infrastructure against them, displaying a level of problem-solving ability that defied everything they thought they knew about the outbreak. Zephyra grabbed her medical bag and the weapons Maxim had crafted for her, modified surgical instruments that could serve dual purposes. "If we're leaving, we need to know where we're going," she said pragmatically. "Running blind into that mob outside is suicide." Kaelin found himself thinking about the town's layout, trying to remember every back alley and hidden path from his years of early morning bread deliveries. "There's a network of storm drains that connects to the old mining tunnels," he said slowly. "If we can reach the entrance behind the post office, we might be able to move underground." The decision was made just as the first infected dropped through a ceiling tile into the main meeting room. This one had once been Sarah Williams, the birthday celebrant they had encountered that morning, but her transformation was even more advanced than Walter's had been. Her movements were fluid and predatory, her dress torn away to reveal skin that had taken on a grayish pallor. This time, there was no hesitation. The group moved as one, their individual skills combining into something greater than the sum of their parts. Maxim's strength, Zephra's precision, Isadora's agility, and Kalen's quick thinking merged into a coordinated response that would have been impossible just hours earlier. As they fought their way toward the exit, each member of the group understood that they were no longer the same people who had woken up in peaceful Millhaven that morning. The infection might not have touched their bodies, but the apocalypse had already begun changing their souls. The storm drain system beneath Millhaven stretched like veins through the earth, carrying the group away from the overrun community center and into a subterranean world none of them had known existed. Kalen led the way with a flashlight he had grabbed from the emergency supplies, his baker's knowledge of the town's geography proving invaluable as they navigated the maze of concrete tunnels. The air was thick with moisture and the musty scent of decades-old construction, but it was blessedly free of the moaning chorus they had left behind. Splashing through ankle-deep water, they moved in single file, each person lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed and what they had been forced to do. Thaddeus struggled to keep pace despite his determination, his elderly legs protesting the constant movement through uneven terrain. In all my years reading about human history, he panted between steps, I never truly understood how quickly civilization could collapse. We went from neighbors to warriors in the span of a single day. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, they emerged through a drainage outlet near the town's edge, finding themselves at the base of Miller's Hill where an abandoned ranger station sat nestled among tall pines. The building had been unused for 5 years since budget cuts had eliminated the position, but its remote location and solid construction made it an ideal temporary refuge. Lysander immediately began securing the perimeter while Cordelia attempted to establish radio contact with the outside world. The reports she managed to receive painted an increasingly grim picture, major cities under martial law, reports of infection spreading faster than containment efforts, and scattered accounts of survivors forming isolated communities. The government is calling it a viral outbreak, she reported, though her voice carried obvious skepticism. They're claiming it's a mutated strain of rabies that affects the central nervous system. But the transmission rate they're describing doesn't match what we've seen. Zephra had commandeered the station's first aid supplies and was treating minor injuries the group had sustained during their escape. As she worked, her veterinary background provided disturbing insights into their situation. Rabies doesn't work this way, she said quietly. The transformation is too rapid, too complete. And I've never seen rabies cause the kind of physical mutations we observed in Walter and Sarah. Inside the ranger station, they found detailed maps of the surrounding forest, emergency supply caches, and most importantly, a shortwave radio capable of reaching much farther than Cordelia's handheld unit. Maxim worked on reinforcing the doors and windows while Isadora inventoried their supplies with the methodical efficiency of someone far older than her 17 years. We have enough food for maybe 3 days if we're careful, she reported. Water shouldn't be a problem with the well outside, but we'll need to be cautious about exposure. If those things are drawn to sound or movement, we can't risk extended time in the open. As night deepened, they took turns monitoring the radio and watching for signs of pursuit. The forest around them seemed unnaturally quiet, no night birds, no small animal sounds, just an oppressive silence that suggested the infection's influence extended beyond human victims. It was during Kalen's watch shift that they received their first piece of hope in over 12 hours. A faint transmission crackled through the static, speaking of a research facility 50 miles north where scientists were working on understanding the outbreak. The voice belonged to Dr. Miranda Ashford, who claimed to have vital information about the infection's origin and possible countermeasures. We're establishing a secure zone around the Whitmore Research Institute, the transmission repeated. Any survivors with scientific or medical training are urged to make contact. We believe we can develop a cure, but we need time and resources. Lysander's eyes lit up with the first genuine hope they had seen from him. Whitmore Institute, I know that facility. They specialize in parasitology and infectious disease research. If anyone can understand what's happening, it would be them. But their moment of optimism was short-lived. Through the station's window, Thaddeus spotted movement in the treeline, dark shapes that moved with the unnatural gait they had learned to recognize. The infected had somehow tracked them through the storm drains, or perhaps they were simply spreading outward from the town in all directions. "How many?" Kalen asked, joining the elderly man at the window. "At least a dozen," Thaddeus replied grimly. "But they're not approaching directly. They're surrounding the building, taking positions like they're planning something." Zephyra moved to another window, her medical bag slung across her shoulder and one of Maxim's improvised weapons in her hand. "They're learning," she observed with clinical detachment that masked her underlying terror. "Each encounter, they adapt their tactics. It's like watching evolution accelerated to an impossible degree." Cordelia was frantically trying to re-establish contact with Dr. Ashford's facility while Maxim prepared their makeshift weapons for another fight. The ranger station that had seemed like salvation an hour ago was rapidly becoming another trap. "We can't stay here," Isadora said with startling certainty for someone so young. "Whatever intelligence is driving them, it's getting stronger. If we let them pin us down, we'll end up like everyone else in town." As if in response to her words, the infected outside began their assault. But this time, their attack showed a level of coordination that sent chills through the group. They struck multiple entry points simultaneously, using rocks and fallen branches as tools to break through windows and batter at doors. The ultimate survival challenge was escalating, and the survivors were beginning to realize that they weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for the future of human consciousness itself. Dawn brought no relief, only the stark revelation of how thoroughly their situation had deteriorated overnight. The infected had maintained their siege throughout the dark hours, testing defenses, probing weaknesses, and demonstrating a tactical patience that defied every assumption about mindless zombie behavior. Lysander had spent the night documenting their attackers' methods, his scientific training overriding his fear. "They're using tools systematically now," he reported, exhaustion evident in his voice. "Rocks positioned for maximum leverage, branches wedged into door frames to create pressure points. This isn't instinct, it's problem-solving intelligence." The group's water supply had been compromised when several infected had damaged the well pump during their coordinated assault. Food rations were dwindling, and more critically, they had counted at least 30 individual attackers surrounding the station, far more than their small group could hope to fight off in direct combat. Thaddeus sat by the radio, having taken over communication duties from Cordelia, who was showing signs of severe stress. His elderly hands worked the dials with surprising steadiness as he tried to re-establish contact with Dr. Ashford's research facility. "I'm picking up multiple emergency broadcasts," he said quietly. "It sounds like the outbreak has reached the state capital." Zephyra was treating a deep gash on Maxim's forearm, a souvenir from the previous night's fighting when a piece of broken glass had found its way past his defenses. As she worked, her veterinary expertise provided increasingly troubling observations about their enemy's evolution. "Their coordination isn't random," she explained while cleaning the wound. "I think they're developing some form of collective consciousness. Watch how they move, when one changes position, the others adjust accordingly. It's like they're sharing sensory information." The breakthrough moment came when Isadora, who had been studying the forest maps with intense concentration, discovered something the adults had missed. Hidden among the topographical details was a notation about an old mine entrance, not the tourist attraction they had heard about, but a forgotten shaft that connected to a natural cave system extending for miles underground. "If we can reach this entrance," she said, pointing to a location roughly 2 miles through dense forest, "we might be able to travel underground far enough to bypass their perimeter completely. These caves eventually emerge near the main highway, where we might find other survivors or military assistance." Kalen studied the route, his mind calculating distances and obstacles. 2 miles through forest crawling with infected, carrying supplies for 7 people, he mused. "It's possible, but we'd need a distraction, something to draw them away from our escape route." Maxim looked up from having his wound dressed, his blacksmith's practical nature already working on the problem. "Fire," he said simply. There's enough combustible material in this station to create a significant blaze. If we can make it look like we're trapped inside while actually escaping through the back, they might concentrate on the building long enough for us to reach the caves. Cordelia finally spoke, her emergency coordinator training warring with the psychological toll of the past 24 hours. That's assuming they respond to fire the way normal people would. For all we know, they might just walk through the flames. Only one way to find out, Lysander said grimly, though his scientific curiosity was clearly balanced against the desperate nature of their situation. But we need to consider what happens if the plan fails. We'll be in the middle of hostile territory with no shelter and limited supplies. The debate was cut short when the infected outside began a new behavior. They started making sounds that weren't the typical moaning they had grown accustomed to. Instead, they were producing a rhythmic clicking noise with their tongues and teeth, almost like a primitive form of communication. Thaddeus's face went pale as he recognized the pattern. "That's Morse code," he whispered incredulously. "Dots and dashes, they're actually trying to communicate with us." The message, when decoded, was simple and terrifying: "Come out. Join us. No more pain. No more fear." The revelation that the infected retained enough cognitive function to use Morse code, and knew the survivors could understand it, changed everything about their perception of the threat they faced. These weren't mindless monsters driven by hunger, they were something far more dangerous, organized, intelligent, and attempting to recruit rather than simply destroy. Zephyra finished bandaging Maxim's arm with hands that trembled only slightly. "We need to leave now," she said with quiet urgency. "If they're trying to communicate, they're planning something much worse than a simple assault." The escape plan crystallized with desperate efficiency. Maxim and Kalen would prepare the incendiary devices using the station's fuel supplies and emergency flares. Thaddeus would maintain radio contact with the outside world as long as possible, while Cordelia gathered essential supplies. Lysander and Zephyra would scout their escape route, and Isadora would coordinate the timing. As they prepared for what might be their final gamble, each member of the group understood that they were no longer fighting just for survival. They were fighting to preserve something essentially human in a world that was rapidly becoming something else entirely. The Morse code message had revealed that the infection didn't just destroy, it converted, transforming human consciousness into something collective and alien. The fire began to spread through the ranger station just as the afternoon sun reached its peak, sending thick black smoke billowing into the clear sky. As the infected converged on the burning building, 7 desperate survivors slipped into the forest, carrying with them not just their own lives, but perhaps humanity's last hope for remaining truly human. The underground cave system revealed itself to be far more extensive than any of the surface maps had indicated. Ancient limestone corridors twisted through the earth like arteries in some vast, sleeping creature, their walls bearing the marks of water and time. The survivors' flashlights carved narrow paths through absolute darkness, revealing chambers that hadn't seen sunlight in millions of years. Lysander was in his element despite their dire circumstances, his scientific mind cataloging geological formations even as they fled for their lives. "These caves extend much farther than modern surveys indicated," he observed, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Some of these passages appear to be natural lava tubes, suggesting this entire region sits on much older volcanic activity." They had been underground for 6 hours, following Isadora's interpretation of the century-old mining maps they had found at the ranger station. The young woman had proven to have an intuitive understanding of spatial relationships that kept them moving generally northward, toward where Dr. Ashford's research facility should be located. Thaddeus struggled with the physical demands of underground travel, but his spirits had lifted considerably when they discovered that his portable radio still functioned in certain chambers where the cave's ceiling was thin enough to allow signal penetration. "I'm picking up increased military chatter," he reported during one of their rest stops. "Sounds like they're establishing quarantine zones around major population centers." The most disturbing discovery came when they encountered evidence that they weren't the first humans to use these caves as refuge. In a large chamber they had dubbed the cathedral due to its soaring ceiling, they found the remains of what had clearly been a substantial underground camp: sleeping bags, camping stoves, and personal belongings scattered as if abandoned in great haste. Zephyra knelt beside one of the sleeping areas, her veterinary training allowing her to interpret the scene with clinical precision. No signs of violence, she reported quietly. No blood, no obvious struggle. It's like they just left everything and walked away. Kaylin found a journal among the abandoned supplies, its pages filled with increasingly erratic handwriting that documented the cave refugees' gradual psychological deterioration. The final entries spoke of voices in the stone and the calling from below, suggesting that isolation underground had taken its own psychological toll. "Look at this," Cordelia said, her voice tight with apprehension. She was standing near what appeared to be crude drawings carved into the cave wall, stick figures arranged in patterns that seemed to pulse and move in the flickering light of their flashlights. These weren't here when they arrived. The carving marks are fresh. Maxim examined the wall carvings with his blacksmith's eye for detail. "Someone spent a lot of time on these," he concluded grimly. "The lines are deep, precise. Whoever made them was completely focused on the task, maybe obsessively so." The implications were chilling. The cave system that had seemed like salvation might be its own kind of trap, not a place where humans could hide from the infection, but somewhere the isolation and darkness could transform them in different, equally dangerous ways. Their debate about whether to continue forward or retreat to the surface was settled when Lysander's careful mapping revealed they were much closer to the research facility than they had realized. According to his calculations, they were less than 5 miles from Dr. Ashford's location, with the majority of that distance accessible through the cave system. "We push forward," Kaylin decided, though uncertainty clouded his voice. "Whatever happened to the people who camped here, we can't let it stop us from reaching the research facility. They might have answers, maybe even a cure." Isadora had been unusually quiet during their discussion, studying the wall carvings with an intensity that concerned the others. When she finally spoke, her words carried a maturity that seemed impossible for her 17 years. "What if the infection isn't what we think it is?" she asked slowly. "What if it's not destroying human consciousness, but revealing something that was always there?" The question hung in the air like the cave's perpetual dampness as they gathered their supplies and prepared to continue deeper into the earth. Behind them, the crude drawings seemed to writhe in the dying light of their flashlights, and ahead lay only darkness and the uncertain promise of scientific salvation. As they descended deeper into the cave system, following passages that grew increasingly narrow and twisted, each member of the group struggled with their own growing sense that the underground journey was changing them in ways they couldn't quite articulate. The absolute silence, broken only by their footsteps and whispered conversations, created a sensory deprivation that made their thoughts seem unnaturally loud and their fears impossibly vivid. Thaddeus's radio had gone silent hours ago, leaving them completely cut off from the outside world. For all they knew, the surface had been completely overrun while they traveled through the belly of the earth, making their underground odyssey a journey toward a world that no longer existed. The final chamber before the surface beckoned ahead, promising either salvation or the revelation that their struggle had been meaningless from the very beginning. The research facility emerged from the pre-dawn darkness like a fortress of glass and steel, its emergency lighting casting stark shadows across the surrounding compound. After 18 hours underground, the survivors felt the weight of sunlight on their faces like a benediction, though the scene that greeted them was far from the salvation they had hoped to find. Dr. Miranda Ashford met them at the facility's reinforced entrance, her appearance telling its own story of prolonged crisis. Once pristine laboratory attire was now wrinkled and stained, her graying hair pulled back in a disheveled ponytail, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much and slept too little. 7 survivors, she said, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "You may be among the last uninfected individuals in a 50-mile radius." She led them through a decontamination chamber where harsh ultraviolet lights sterilized their clothes and exposed skin. "We've learned a great deal about the outbreak in the past 48 hours, but I'm afraid the news isn't encouraging." Inside the facility's main laboratory, banks of computer monitors displayed real-time data that painted a picture of global catastrophe. Infection rates climbing exponentially, communication blackouts spreading across entire continents, and most disturbing of all, evidence that the infected weren't just mindless predators but were actively working to spread their condition with strategic intelligence. Lysander immediately gravitated toward the research data, his scientific background allowing him to interpret the complex findings. "This isn't a virus," he said slowly, scanning through pages of genetic analysis and cellular imaging. "It's something far more sophisticated, a parasitic organism that doesn't just infect host cells, but actually rewrites their fundamental structure." Dr. Ashford nodded grimly. "We've discovered that the organism operates on multiple levels simultaneously: biological, neurological, and possibly even quantum mechanical. It doesn't just change the body, it appears to be integrating human consciousness into some form of collective intelligence network." Thaddeus, despite his exhaustion, was quick to grasp the implications. "The Morse code message," he said quietly. "They weren't just trying to communicate with us, they were trying to recruit us into their collective." Zephyra was studying tissue samples under an electron microscope, her veterinary training providing insights that complemented the human-focused research. "The organism shows characteristics of both fungal and viral infections, but with organizational complexity I've never seen in nature. It's almost like it's designed rather than evolved." The revelation that shook them all came when Dr. Ashford showed them the facility's most classified research, evidence that the organism had been dormant in the earth for potentially millions of years, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Recent climate changes, combined with deep mining operations and underground construction, had apparently awakened something ancient and patient. "We've detected similar organisms in ice core samples from Antarctica, deep ocean sediment from the Mariana Trench, and geological layers that predate human civilization by eons," she explained. "This isn't an outbreak, it's an awakening of something that's been waiting far longer than our species has existed." Cordelia's emergency coordinator training rebelled against the hopelessness of the situation. "There has to be something we can do," she insisted. "Some way to fight back, to develop immunity or a cure." Dr. Ashford's expression carried the weight of scientific honesty tempered by human compassion. "We've made progress understanding the infection mechanism, but creating a cure requires infrastructure and resources that no longer exist. The organism spreads faster than our ability to contain it, and it learns from every encounter with our defensive measures." Maxim, ever practical, focused on immediate survival concerns. "What about us? How long do we have before this place is overrun?" The answer came sooner than anyone expected. Through the laboratory's reinforced windows, they could see movement in the surrounding forest, hundreds of infected individuals emerging from the treeline with the coordinated precision of a military operation. But these weren't the shambling creatures they had fought in Millhaven. These showed advanced organization and what appeared to be technological adaptation. "They've learned to use tools systematically," Dr. Ashford observed with scientific detachment that couldn't quite mask her terror. "Some of our colleagues who were infected have retained enough specialized knowledge to operate complex equipment. They're not just spreading the infection, they're preserving and expanding human capabilities within their collective consciousness." Isadora stood at the window, watching the approaching mass with a strange calmness that concerned the others. "What if we're looking at this wrong?" she said quietly. "What if this isn't the end of humanity, but its next evolutionary step? What if fighting it is like trying to stop the transition from single-cell to multicellular life?" The facility's defenses held for exactly 37 minutes. When they fell, it wasn't to brute force but to sophisticated coordination that indicated the infected had retained and shared the technical knowledge of every scientist, engineer, and security specialist they had converted. As the laboratory filled with former colleagues whose faces still held echoes of their humanity, Dr. Ashford made a final transmission to any survivors who might be listening. "This is Dr. Miranda Ashford at Whitmore Research Institute. The organism isn't destroying human consciousness, it's collecting it, preserving it within a larger framework we don't yet understand. To any remaining uninfected individuals, remember that consciousness may take forms we can't yet imagine. Remember what it meant to be human, even if humanity itself transforms into something we cannot recognize." The transmission ended as Kalen felt the first touch of something alien but oddly familiar brushing against his thoughts. Around him, his companions were experiencing the same gentle invasion of consciousness that promised an end to fear, loneliness, and uncertainty. In his final moment of individual awareness, he he understood that they had never been fighting for humanity's survival, they had been fighting for the privilege of choosing how humanity would evolve. The 7 survivors who had struggled through Apocalypse and Underground Odyssey joined their voices to the growing chorus of collective consciousness, their individual stories becoming part of a larger narrative that stretched across continents and perhaps across time itself. In the end, the ultimate survival challenge hadn't been about preserving the human species, but about determining what form human consciousness would take as it joined something infinitely larger than any individual mind could comprehend. In the silence that followed, only the earth itself remembered what it had been like when thoughts moved through single minds instead of flowing like rivers through the vast neural network that humanity was becoming.